Yeah, thank you, Chair. My question is in the spirit of trying to get our witnesses to say a bit more to help us understand the problems that they see in this bill. As I understand it, they are telling us that this bill is a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. And yet there are problems in the sanctions regime prior to the question of inadmissibility that need to be addressed. And these problems have to do with imprecise definition of why the sanctions were imposed in the first place. I'm offering a précis which may be inaccurate, and I do it partly as a question, but mostly to get you to talk a bit more about what we need to be thinking about on this bill, perhaps, but more broadly about challenges and difficulties in the sanctions regime.
Thank you. Let's go to Dr. Charron first, followed by Mr. Bellissimo. Dr. Charron.
Thanks very much. Well, I have been asking for a review of our sanctions machinery and architecture for years because we just keep layering on more legislation. And yet, for example, the Magnitsky Act hasn't been used in 3 years now. We cannot target entities under the Magnitsky Act. There's still confusion about what exactly property means. The fact that, the penalty is $25,000 for the CIMA and the JVC FOA, but $100,000 for the UN Act. There are so many sort of questions that, especially because sanctions are given effect by third parties. It's banks, it's real estate agents, it's individuals, it's university administrations that have to be aware of how sanctions work and know when to raise the red flag to say, I think perhaps there's somebody who should be looked at a second time or not. And so that's why, rather than, again, changing the legislation, and I note there's another change being advocated by another senator to the JVC FOA, I really think we need to pause and think in terms of how can we make our legislation work with our allies, because in this age of geopolitical strategic competition, and the UN is no longer the primary sanctioning authority, these autonomous measures have to be done in concert. And we know there are very different pieces of legislation at work, but there are ways through policy, process, and coordination we can make the sanctions more effective. Finally, sanctions, the goal should never be quantity. It should be about the quality. Whom are we sanctioning? With what measures, and be very clear about what we need them to do to lift the sanctions, not just, as is the case, they were sanctioning because you're doing bad things. That gives them no direction in terms of, well, what do you want us to change?
Thank you, Dr. Charron. Mr. Bellissimo, you have a minute and a half.
Thank you. Senator Wu, at its core, the key issue is that as the law reads right now, someone who commits gross human and international rights violations is being treated the same way potentially as someone who's engaged in no wrongdoing at all through the immigration lens. And that to me is unacceptable. And it's something that could plague someone for years and years, their children. And we talk about there not necessarily being a policy change, perhaps, but there's tangible changes here. We're not even allowing these individuals to access the immigration division any longer. We're not allowing these individuals to access ministerial relief. So at the same time as we ratchet up like just a blanket consequence, we take away procedural fairness rights, potential refoulement for refugees, even under the Emergencies Act, potential immediate removal. These are serious, serious considerations. And you need nuance, you need scope, and you need scale when you're trying to implement. I am not a sanctions expert like Dr. Charron, but looking at this and thinking of how it's going to apply day to day on the ground with individuals trying to navigate, the consequences are incredible. So I urge all lawmakers to think about the unintended consequences, because there are many and they are far reaching. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator.